I think we're live, unless YouTube is messing with me this morning. Right, so this is, you created a new issue to walk just the new stuff that we have, because right, we have like 5 reviews, I think, at this point over this stuff.
Yeah, this is the same issue we reviewed last time. We just removed the features that we didn't discuss yet to another issue.
Oh, I see.
I kept the same issue. It still has some active discussions on it. I thought we'd cover this, and then if we have time, move on to the property name that I created recently.
I think I know the answer to that already, because we never have time.
Yeah, well, I mean, it might be nice to time box, actually.
Yeah.
Maybe the first half on this, and just so I get some feedback on the second issue.
Yeah, we should do that.
Okay, you can you skip, all of this has been reviewed until we get to the options.
This one, right?
Yeah, so last time we got some feedback to lift up the reader and writer options, so I lifted up 3 properties. There's one more I didn't lift up, which is the skip validation. I think that's still pending. I mean, we'll lift it up if we need it. So I created 3 properties here. And then the other feedback was there was concern about mixing design time and runtime type behavior. And I added back, in a way, this original add attribute method, except I now list, in this case, one of the attributes that's covered later in this document. And this is the main thing I want to get feedback on for this issue, is that, are we okay with doing this? This does not return any kind of runtime information like the old approach where you call get class or get class.get property and then add the attribute to the class or the property. So this just silently says, here's a runtime attribute, and we can expose the runtime information at some future point. The runtime future information won't be based on attributes, based off of bools and ints and that sort of thing.
So with this whole JSON object, the reflection for JSON type is now removed, correct?
I'm not sure what you mean by
so you used to have
okay.
like a method get class info or something,
yes,
and
yes.
then it would return JSON class info.
That
and that one is now internal, correct? Because
yes,
people would just use this. Awesome, I love it.
Okay.
I think it's a. Now I have a question. Why there are parameters that are optional for the get attribute? Like, what does it mean to add an attribute, property attribute, and not specify which property?
Okay. Today, the attributes, if you put design time attributes, can either apply to a class or a property. If they apply to the class, then they apply to all the properties, at least for these types of attributes now. So if you don't specify property, it applies to all of them. If you specify the property, it specifies that one property, and if you don't specify anything, which is the first one, it is global to this instance.
So one thing I would do is I would always put the JSON ignore property attribute as the first parameter.
Okay, that was one of my questions I had. It's kind of like name comma value right now, and I wasn't sure if there was a guideline.
Why is it specifically the ignore property?
Because that's the only one covered in this document. There will be other ones.
Well, like, are you going to add a different attribute for every attribute type, or is it going to be a base class collection?
Okay, so originally I had this, and it was just kind of loosely typed, and you could add any attribute. This one, I'm assuming that I want to create these 3 overloads for the 10 attributes we end up having. So it might be 30 overloads.
Well, why wouldn't you just add a base type for all JSON-related attributes?
We can, but there was originally some discussion about discoverability. But this could be all collapsed into the base. If we had a base type to all attributes, or just call it attribute even, system.attribute. It's pseudo strongly typed here, and a little more discoverable. But it does mean that whenever we add a new attribute, we have to add these 3 methods.
Yeah, I would do some base type. Either directly system attribute or actually just inject in the middle.
Okay, so
something.
so we don't have any concerns like what are the valid attributes?
Well, this feature is like for advanced scenarios. So like if it was, how do I serialize an object that has applied attributes, then I would worry about.
I would make JSON serialization attribute, and then you can just hope that either your IDE or MSDN gives you what things derive from this attribute.
So if we have a common base class, yeah, then you just open up the online help, and it'll show you the possible derived types. Okay. Yeah. So like I said, I was considering these, but this is the starting point, so I'll do that.
So I have a question about something you said a minute ago. So you talked about one of these cases applying to the attribute applies to all properties on the type. Which one is that? Is that the second case? Does that apply to the type, or does that apply?
Okay, it depends on the attribute. If the attribute is for a property, like for example, this ignore one is talking about ignoring a specific property.
Yeah.
Then when you call the second one, it's the default for properties, and this is the same at design time. So if you plop that attribute on a class, a focal class, by default, for example, one of the values would be don't serialize read-only properties. And you'd kind of suck to have to put that on every single property. And not all attributes may apply to a property. So you may get an exception if it doesn't apply.
Okay, so it's intended to have validation and things like that.
It'll look at the applies to information on the attribute to figure out if maybe some custom logic for some of the attributes.
I wonder about this because in MVC we have things like this where it's sort of like, well, you can apply this here and it means this, or you can apply this here and it means this. I guess my advice or sort of my principle is like, if there are going to have attributes that apply to the type that affect all the properties that belong to that type, make sure that it's really unambiguous that that's what that means, versus being something that is equally valid on the type and equally valid on the property. Like it really, naming and everything has to sort of reflect those semantics.
Yeah.
Or consider just not having those because they're a little bit complicated to use or a little bit complicated.
Yeah, my question is like for example, JSON ignore property. What does it mean to apply it on the type? Does it mean that the type itself becomes unserializable, or does it just
all
mean...
the properties? It's basically I'm applying this attribute to all properties of this type.
But what does it mean? Because if you don't serialize the type, what do you get? Like just open brace, close brace?
Okay, so scroll down because it actually this attribute has some knobs. It's actually covered in there. Because I originally had some of these knobs on this issue and currently checked in, that I decided to cover this one attribute here. And I did add two features here that were discussed. I'm not going to implement these right away because we have another time slot for this, but this is API proposal. That the first one, ignore, says, yes, ignore everything. And if you drop that on the class, it would essentially turn into everything off by default.
Right.
And then you would have to turn it on each property by explicitly to override that. So you could actually flip the behavior. That's not something that is a like a core scenario or anything like that, but it's could be pseudo useful for something, and it just kind of falls out because of the semantics. And then the ignore read only. This is pretty common, I think, request to say don't serialize properties that don't have setter. And then the other two I had previously, and was talking about the values at that point.
What's the default behavior for read only?
They're all false.
So if I just slap JSON ignore property on a property, it is as if it's not there. It says ignore nothing, therefore it's the same as if I didn't put the attribute on something.
Ignore. You mean if you don't set any properties on it?
Okay, that's a bad design.
Yeah, that's because I mean, if you read code where you just say open bracket JSON ignore property close bracket,
that looks like the
and
property.
that sounds like you're ignoring it, but then because you didn't set any properties, it basically does not.
Okay, well, I mean that's the problem, I guess, with having multiple options on an attribute.
Yeah.
It has no, in this particular case, not all cases, it doesn't have any semantics by itself.
I mean, quite frankly, that's one. Also, I think just from a schema standpoint, it might become fairly busy if you have to apply that attribute with, and then you have to set properties on it. It might actually be easier if there are different properties. that might actually read easier too.
Okay, so I got
It's more
feedback
metadata
that
for us, but like it's
Jeremy's feedback that okay, the design was not intuitive, right? Because you can slap that property, but it doesn't ignore anything.
right.
And then, can you clarify what you were saying now?
So like you could imagine instead of having one property with four, okay, bad describing, like basically when you put this one attribute on it, right, you have four other properties you have to set. Alternatively, you could imagine a design where instead of having one attribute with four properties, you have four attributes.
Yeah. That would, I mean, in order to get around the first concern, I think that's what I'd have to do is have four attributes, or three attributes, maybe two of these could be combined, maybe. The
Yeah,
last two.
I was about to say that you can probably combine some of them, right? The non-value one, just having one.
And you mentioned ignoring read-only properties, and I know that we have guidance that says not to have set-only properties. What is your thought on handling a set-only property?
Oh, okay. Well, since it said only, it won't be serialized, of course. But it could be deserialized by default. So it just does, I guess, what would be natural. You have the data, it'll set it. No special logic. Okay, so I can split this up at least into three attributes. Ignore. And honestly, we don't need the ignore read only. This was an ask, or it was brought up, and I have, like I said, a feature to support ignore. And I think this is pretty common. So, but we don't necessarily need it at this point.
The thing that I
That would
think
be
that
ignore
is
read only.
the thing that I think that is a little bit confusing about ignore read only is that it only makes sense when applied at the class level.
Yes.
Because you don't need ignore read only. You could just say ignore this property because it is read only.
That is.
So it only makes sense either as a global setting or as a class level thing.
Yeah, and I guess if we split that into its own attribute and say class only and not property only, that would make more sense.
And the other settings on here, like the ignore setting, only really makes sense on a property because you wouldn't want it for class.
Well, you might. I mean,
It's kind of nonsense though. Like why?
well, no, because then you can turn it on. It's like security thing almost. You can turn everything off on individual properties. But like I said, that is not a requirement. That just kind of fell out from.
So you preserve the order. If I first apply attribute to my whole assembly, say ignore everything, and then I keep adding attributes, you keep the order.
I mean, an attribute applied a default to a class can be overridden by a property. Like in this case.
Yeah, it's basically hierarchical.
But you don't keep the order if I turn it off for a property, and then I apply again to re-enable it. What happens?
You mean like if you apply the same attribute multiple times? I would honestly say we should probably throw and say your state is invalid.
You add the same attribute more than once, yeah, you'll get an exception. Like a design time, you can't add the same attribute because we have.
Yeah, it's already disallowed right now.
Because the attributes will be
single
instance. I see.
Yeah, so I think ignore should just be by itself. Ignore read only should be by itself and applicable to a class. Or I guess it's a type that's different than class.
Do we believe that the default of serializing read-only properties is a good idea?
Yes.
Well, so I think a lot of people end up defining immutable structs. And those immutable structs, you can generally initialize the value of the constructor. And so you want to be able to serialize your read-only properties. That way you can actually reconstruct the object using a constructor or a builder pattern.
How do we deserialize that guy?
That
Different system on the other side.
There's
It's a
another
super
feature
common
for
scenario
that.
now.
yeah.
You have to bundle them up and call the constructor or whatever. Immutable type.
You may use a reader on the other side and read JSON and manually construct the tree.
But I think it's fairly common to have immutable types, structs or classes, where you have a builder pattern to update things. In which case, you wouldn't want to have to jump through extra hoops to make 90% of your types work with the deserialized.
So think about like 2 years from now if they do the records feature for C#, because like the DTOs that people write if you're using nullability checking just like make you sad. right? Like they're all every DTO you have is a warning about you have a constructor that doesn't set these properties. So something like this really wants records. If you're using nullability, like if you care about that, you will want to use records with the serializer.
And then you've got languages like F# where everything is immutable by default. And if you ship it where everyone's going to have to say, yes, I want every single type to be serializable with explicit options, it's basically a non-starter.
It's half of a must-have feature for Azure SDK. Interestingly, yes, you observed currently the serializer doesn't let you deserialize such immutable object graphs, but we talked about it. Maybe in the future can enable it.
And then I don't know how I feel about the null values, because I really feel that the default value of the attribute should be to be, like if you made an ignore null value attribute, if you didn't specify anything, it feels like it should ignore null values.
Yeah, I'll have to revisit it if we split this into multiple attributes, because it doesn't make as much sense. But the idea is if it's null, then at like a higher level, you know, it doesn't have a value it can be overridden at the lower level. But if that's good, the semantics for these bools anyway, it doesn't make as much sense.
The other thing to think about in terms of having multiple options on one attribute is, since you do have this idea of scoping, and since you do have this idea that like settings are applied globally versus at the class level, property level, it's like, well, what if I write a class and I don't know what the setting is application level or at the assembly level when I wrote the class? I can't know what the settings are that are being applied at a bigger scope, but these settings would win if they're a property. And maybe I just wanted to say, I guess they're nullable.
They're nullable now.
Yeah, is that the reason?
Because there's four things on here, you might only want to set one of them.
Yeah.
But if they're split into separate attributes, or maybe 4 separate attributes, then they wouldn't have to be nullable, because you wouldn't add it unless you know it falls.
Yeah, just being 4 separate properties.
Okay. So I think I have enough then. This is all this document covers. I think I have enough, unless there's any other comments. That I'll update this and just send an email out, on the updated version. I don't know if you have to.
Yeah, so I didn't submit a PR from the last one. Normally I submit a PR for every single round. Like today I will just submit the round 4 and round 3 in one PR. And then you basically get an email. I will just respond to the meeting with the PR.
Okay, so yeah, if we can go to the other attribute.
So question about the attributes. Are they gonna be in the same namespace as the serializer?
Yeah, any attribute currently that you can apply to a class going to be in the same namespace. So if it's a base class, perhaps that should be somewhere else to kind of hide it. There's this policy namespace that's intended for people that are adding new attributes and things like that, to hide a few.
Is it because when you create serializable types, would apply them as well? Okay, so it's not just to override it. You're using the same attributes to attribute the type manually, and then
these are design and runtime. Yep.
And also, like, so at some point, I kind of asked the question: do we have the right namespaces for the reader, writer, and the serializer? It seems kind of backwards that the serializer is in a sub namespace of something that contains very low-level ByRef types.
So I would agree with that. I think we should probably have a separate pass over the whole thing, because it's easier to look at the whole thing and then shuffle things around.
So the reader and writer and the document are in the root namespace, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So which they do not have their own namespace. So it would be we'd have to pull it out of system.text.json.
Yeah, because like some people will just hear that we release system.text.json package. They will naturally go to the root namespace and find very complicated types.
Well, I mean, should we have system text JSON.reader?
Yeah, something like this. I mean, it's unfortunate that reader doesn't work for the writer.
Or the other option, which was brought up before, was just to put everything in the same namespace. But I think that we will have 20 some 30 classes in the end, and that's kind of adding a lot, I think. To
Yeah, I think one namespace would be bad because you wouldn't know what applies to which feature. It's basically three independent features.
Yeah, we should just take a holistic set and then just shuffle things around quickly to see what we like, and then just rename.
Okay, I guess I'll create another issue for that then.
Yeah, I just didn't know. We should just set up a meeting like half an hour maybe, and just go over the list.
Okay.
And pontificate over the name.
Okay, I won't create an issue.
All right, so then close this one here.
Okay, so this is just another attribute. And yeah, keep scroll up a tiny bit. So this has three main types of functionality. It allows you to specify a name of a property. So if you just want to say this is always called foo, ignoring casing or whatever, I mean, you just want to explicitly name it. Or you can apply an attribute that knows how to convert a name. In this case, we're going to provide a default implementation for camel casing. And then if you wanted to extend this in some way, there's the base attribute of this here will allow you to do that. You can create your snake casing, for example. It also, on that base attribute, has a flag that says whether you want to use case-insensitive property names. So yeah, these are the four, kind of like four features here.
Case-insensitive, is that variant ignore case? Well, because we have culture, like there's the current culture, there's thread culture,
I think
we have lots of
variant.
culture stuff.
Yeah,
so I'm just wondering what insensitive.
I mean, I'll look at what JSON.net does, I think, but I think it,
Culture would be really surprising.
I think it makes sense just to do invariant.
I agree.
JSON.net does invariant. It does ordinal comparisons.
Okay, I'll call that out in the API.
Right, ordinal ignore case. That's one.
Or what?
Ordinal ignore case. Invariant and ordinal are different in like 3 places. Eric. So, I think I've seen the post once. I was just confirming what we wanted that property to do. We have a lot of different ignore cases in .NET.
And we use them all.
Willy-nilly.
So yeah, just take a look at the examples here. This is just basically applying design time attributes. So here, you just say, hey, I want this property to be an explicit name. That's a JSON property name attribute. And then down below is applying a camel casing attribute.
Does the word converter need to be in that attribute?
No, I couldn't think of it seemed like it needed something.
Just JSON camel casing seems to apply.
Is this live streamed or is this internal?
It's live stream.
Okay. Hi, everyone.
So yeah, I was about to say the same thing about the name. Like, I think JSON name would also be easier, right? I mean, what else would it be?
Yeah, property name. If it's applied to a property, yeah. There are some collisions. I don't know if we care JSON.net on some of this stuff. And I have to take a look at that.
Oh, there are conflicts with the attribute.
Well,
in the attribute names.
I have to look, like I said, to make sure.
JSON has JSON property.
Okay, so there's no JSON name then. Okay.
No, there's no JSON property name attribute.
Okay, or just okay. So if we call it JSON property, that would conflict then.
But you
Yes.
can call it JSON name.
Yeah.
There's no JSON name attribute, just JSON property attribute.
What is it allowed to do? Just setting the name as well?
JSON property attribute has many things on it. Like pretty much it gives you most things you can set on a property, like for example, how it behaves when there's a null value, its name, whether it's required or not. Those are all settable on JSON property attribute.
That's a good point. Like if you ever want to add those, maybe JSON name then is an unfortunate choice.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it makes sense. Instead of applying 5 attributes, there's one attribute that lets you specify casing and name and other things.
I mean, the other question is, like, I don't think we care about the conflict of JSON.NET because, I mean, within a single type, we really expect people to use both.
For which now?
Like, I mean, let's say we name our JSON property name attribute just JSON property attribute, like same what JSON.NET does. I mean, the rule of not conflicting comes from the point that when you very commonly mix technologies within the same file, right? Because you don't want to qualify every single thing, right? But I would think if you actually end up using both serializers on the same type, I probably want to specialize everything because like otherwise you have to do the mental gymnastics yourself of like, oh, this JSON attribute comes from JSON.NET, this one comes from the built-in one. Like at that point, you're probably better off just saying, screw it, I just go to the top, I name everything with the platform type, everything with the other one, and then I just have some sort of prefix that I can reason about. Otherwise, you just... I mean, first of all, I don't think it's very likely that people do that, and secondly, the people that do it probably want to understand which attribute comes from where.
So just they would fully qualify it with the namespace.
Well, I would probably do using editors or something at the top to just give things like quick prefixes like JSON net blah.
But the guideline to not conflict is not only for the kind of type name resolution in a file. It's also samples, documentation, searching online. If we name it JSON property attribute, it will be very difficult to find documentation for it, for example.
Why?
Because basically JSON.NET is so mature technology, you will always get hits for JSON.NET.
Yeah, I just don't know whether it's sustainable.
I mean, I'm just finding it amusing where we said with the ignore that we wanted to break one property up into 4, and now we're talking about squishing 4 things into 1.
Yeah,
So,
and I think the biggest difference is that the reason why one big attribute with a bunch of settings doesn't work very well is if you have a concept of defaults on the class type, then they have to be nullable, like I had in the previous example, because you don't want to necessarily apply defaults on 10 things. You know, especially if they're like bools and things like that will have a normal default value.
That is also true.
So that's why originally I did have a JSON property attribute with a few things on it, and I can't remember the name of it at the moment, but it ended up getting split up into like the ignore and
but doesn't not setting have a meaning anyway, a semantic meaning? So why have it be a not set? What does not set mean that's different from one of the true bool values?
So what do you mean by that?
If someone doesn't set up one of the bools that's nullable, the serializer still needs to act, right? So what does it do? It has to pick one of the two options.
No, like think about it this way. You have the attribute applied at the class and at the property, right? Now you basically have to decide for a given setting, let's say ignore null value. Like maybe what you applied at the class level, you only meant to say, you know, ignore read only. So you only said ignore read only. You didn't mean to say ignore or not ignore null values. But if it's a bool, like it's either true or false, right? But neither of these things are the actual setting you meant to apply. You know what I mean? It's basically how do you merge effectively multiple applications of the attributes at different points in the hierarchy. So you have to separate effectively the value was specified to the value was not specified.
So in JSON.NET, just for some context about how it works, JSON property has 17 properties on it, so it's quite a big boy. And I don't know if you talked about this earlier around the ignore property, but nullable attributes aren't really allowed on. No, nullable types aren't allowed on attributes. just because it's not a constant expression, etc., etc. So what I do is, although the property on JSON property is not nullable, I track internally whether something's been set on it. So the internal field is null, and if it isn't set, then I assume there's no value for it, and then I can look to the parent class, for example, to then use its value. So if you haven't set a what would be an example on it, like a behavior for how it handles when there's a null value, it will then look to the class attribute to see how it should behave when there's a null value. And that's done by an internal nullable field, but the actual public value on the attribute is not null, just because of the limitations of attributes.
You can have nullable properties. It's just I'm not sure what the restriction is. Or I mean, you have a nullable field, but you said the property can't be nullable.
I thought on attributes you couldn't have nullable types. Maybe is that like a limitation of .NET framework?
I guess I had in my prototype I had nullable properties, so I can do some research on that. But
Because I definitely remember running into that issue, and I was just Googled it like 5 seconds ago to double check it, and a Stack Overflow issue came up about how nullable ints and attribute constructors or properties isn't allowed. But then again, the question is almost 9 years old.
okay, yeah, so I'll follow up on that then. Like I said, I wasn't running into any issues with the prototype that did this. Okay, so I mean that is something to think about if we want to have a Uber property attribute, like I said, I had that previously. It contained everything for a property except for extensible things like this camel casing, because I don't want to put an enum on that property to just say, do you want camel casing or snake casing or whatever, because then it ties it to a fixed set. So the idea was at that point to have one big attribute, and then for the extension points, it would have their own attribute.
Well, you could have like enum for the built-in converters, and then if you're not happy with one of those values, then you apply an attribute and specify converter.
No, you could do both. Yeah, I didn't take that approach, also because we'd only ship with one right away, so it might be a little goofy to have an enum with one value.
So I just tested it. James is right. Like the compiler, like it lets you declare the nullable, but then as soon as you try to assign the property in the constructor of the construction syntax, when you apply the attribute, says ignore is not a valid named attribute argument because it's not a valid attribute parameter type. Because they basically have to
only constructor arg, or is that
no? When you basically use the when you apply the attribute, you basically have a pseudo constructor call where you say property equals blah, property equals blah, right? And then as soon as you do that, it fails.
Okay, so I'll have to.
So you can't actually assign to it.
But there's a difference between the constructor args and.
Well, what I meant by this is
so I've got it right here. If you use it either as a constructor arg or as a property that you explicitly set, it complains because it can't encode a nullable struct.
Okay, so
because
I'll
basically,
have to look at my prototype then, because I thought I did this.
For attributes, it has to expand it into binary metadata, and nullable is technically a user-defined struct, and there are no struct constants. So.
Okay, so like I said, I'll have to change this.
There's a workaround like what I did. So
yeah, so you had nullable fields at that point.
Yeah.
Which is not horrible, right? You would just have an internal property like, I don't know, effective ignore and effective blah that is basically returning a nullable, and it's either set or not set.
So I understand how it's set.
I haven't found out a problem with JSON.NET.
But how do you then read whether the property was set or not?
Because you basically track it in the setter, right?
Yeah.
you initialize the fields.
How do you read the like?
You have to declare a new property that is internal, that is basically effective, whatever the other property is called, and that returns nullable.
Feedback from before was we shouldn't ever instantiate the properties. We should only look at the property metadata.
Yeah, you can't do that. I mean, you can, but basically the way you would do this, you would just use that. You look at the custom attribute data, and you can ask that guy what initializers were present. I mean, it's pretty straightforward to do that too, but you have to translate it from that point of view, which is also not horrible, honestly. It's actually kind of what you would have to do anyways if you would custom attribute data.
Yeah, I don't like. To me, having a very obvious this is the name has a required string to go with it. Like apply camel case. Like these feel. I don't know why we would want them an Uber attribute.
Well, the problem with the nullables is not because of an Uber attribute. The problem with the nullables is a result of us having to have the hierarchy.
Well, not really, because if you split it up into multiple attributes,
yes,
you can use the presence or the non-presence of the attribute application for that. Right? Because if you apply something at the property level and you have basically one attribute for camel casing and another attribute for ignoring,
if you don't have
then you never have this problem that you have to merge settings you didn't mean to set across hierarchy boundaries, because you just use
the problem is with the hierarchy. If you don't have the hierarchy.
No, but I'm saying that as soon as you have multiple properties, the hierarchy is not a problem, because basically the merging is basically done by is the attribute present, then it takes precedence. If the attribute is not present, then it's merged.
Because the null is basically. If you don't have a hierarchy, you don't need to merge anything, because there are defaults, and basically if the property is is not specified, you would just set it to the default value in the attribute.
Yes, but the point is that because you only have one attribute, you end up having to decide if you merge it across the hierarchy, how you determine that the property wasn't set.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. If you don't have a hierarchy, then you don't have.
But we will have a hierarchy. There's always going to be a hierarchy. Jeremy is basically saying if you split the attribute, the problem disappears.
Unless you want to write the camel case on every single property and putting it on the type.
Do you ever hey, these properties will become a case, but these others won't? That's exactly what I'm saying. Maybe the camel casing is just a type level attribute.
On and not on the individual property.
Yeah. Because on the individual property, if you want to change the casing, well, you may just rename the attribute. I mean, the property.
Or you can runtime some more. Or you can place the other attribute on it. You mean that allows you to explicitly say
to use this name.
Yeah, to use this name feature.
Is camel casing the default?
No.
Should it be?
What's the default?
Whatever your type has. Pascal case, I guess. I mean, normally. I mean,
So in our experience with just having camel casing be the default for ASP.NET, it's far less important to need to configure these things if the default is what.
It's probably true.
Do we have important scenarios where they need to be Pascal case? Is there a rationale for that?
And the only one you could argue is that it might be cheaper to compare the strings, but
James, what does JSON.NET do?
So JSON.NET defaults to Pascal case.
Or whatever you have in your object?
Yeah, it defaults to not applying any naming format to your types, and for ASP.NET, we just happen to configure the serializer to default to use a camel case naming standard.
I mean, you also made that decision long before the modern age as well, and they've kind of kept it. Or do you feel like there's a strong reason why that's the correct thing to do?
I think, I don't necessarily think, just because JSON, I think JSON's ubiquitous and beyond just JavaScript. I think JavaScript, we like to have camel case, but I think for a general serializer, Pascal case is fine, and in cases where you're focused on JavaScript, you can add a camel case converter and then use it. Like I think not applying a naming standard is what I like, but that's my opinion.
So in Azure, most JSON that I've seen, I think it's camel case. Despite the fact that it has, very little to do with JavaScript, I think kind of just went with the convention.
I think part of the concern would be, why is my POCO object not being represented correctly in the JSON when I didn't apply any attributes? Why did the serializer do some magic without me opting into it?
Yeah, I agree. That it's a
Yeah,
concern.
I agree.
I don't know what we should choose, but I agree with this concern.
I certainly want. I named it with a capital letter. Why did you change it to a lowercase letter? Don't do anything unless I tell you to.
Well, I mean, that's something where I honestly don't have strong opinions, but I mean, if you from a .NET side, it makes sense, right? But the question is, does it make sense necessarily when you consider a normal website where you consume the payload from JavaScript, where it's very unnatural to have?
Yeah, I mean, I know what we're going to do. We're going to set it to camel in global settings like we do today.
Right.
So and that's something that our users are happy with. So I can only speak for us.
And what's the way to set it in global setting?
In this or in JSON.NET?
In this.
Because
I do think that at least we should have a global setting.
Yeah.
And then the apply attribute, is that the way to?
Yeah, you can call it attribute.
Should it be a basically first class property on the options? Basically, use camel casing, Boolean. So I don't have to search for attributes. Like it's very obvious how to do it.
Well, the question now becomes like for all the other settings that the attribute has, right? Like this would handle anything that you can express as an attribute as a global setting. In the other case, you would have to promote all of them to properties.
It's just you're saying it's more discoverable.
It's more discoverable and it's super common.
I don't agree with that. I'm just saying that it's not enough to do this one thing. You would have to promote them all.
For consistency, I think you'd want to promote a lot more than just this one line.
Then maybe we should do it. I'm basically saying, like, if we choose the default to be Pascal case, it will be the wrong default for so many people.
Right.
And then they will have to like find the attribute to add an attribute, understand how this whole attribute thing works, which by the way is not super intuitive in general, that I'm calling methods to add attributes on some options type.
Only if you can't apply in that design time.
Well, and for this thing I cannot. I have my POCO types. I want them to be named as in .NET, per .NET conventions, but then my payloads, I want them to be camel case. That will be common.
Well, you applied the attribute on the type then. I'm not sure I follow.
No, so the idea is you're ASP.NET. You don't own the POCOs. You just want, if somebody serializes a POCO, that it has camel case.
So ASP.NET write one line of code to initialize these options.
Right. All I'm saying is that basically, I think so there's two arguments, right? I think nobody disagrees with that we should have a global setting to control casing. I think we all agree with that. Now we're just talking about what's the mechanical way to express that. In the current model, the idea is that everything is based off of attributes, right? Which means any setting that you can apply by an attribute, you can also make it a global setting by just calling this one method. Now we could say that, screw it, there's some settings that are way more common than others and we promote them, that's fine. All that means is that now you have two ways of doing it. Now the question is like which one takes precedence and all of that, right? So I would honestly say my care level is low. I generally agree with you though that I don't like mixing the attribute model with, I guess, global state, I guess, because it's not really intuitive that is the same thing. But if we have that ability, then I think doing like two different things seems problematic because now we have to reason about what the state is.
Just it's a nit, but in .NET there's no way to apply an attribute to everything.
Right.
The highest scope you can apply is to an assembly. So like this is not super intuitive that you can just apply an attribute and it will apply to everything.
Yes, I agree with that.
For the instance of the options. The attributes when you add a global only applied to the options instance.
Okay, yeah. Only applies to the serializers instantiated with these options. Yes, but it applies to all types.
Yes, all types that you use within.
I'm saying there is no way in .NET to apply an attribute to all types.
Well, I guess there's nothing to go for all types. There's assembly level, but
Yeah, that's what. Yeah.
this is
So maybe we just say like for controlling the global state, there are actually properties options.
I would be okay with that.
Yeah.
If you remove that method, I think it makes more sense to promote it. But
And then actually, I would say
do
it would
both.
have also side effect. Now the add attribute methods, I kind of can understand what it does, because frankly, the first overload that doesn't take anything, I feel like unless I read the docs what it does, I would be like so puzzled.
If these were, instead of being named add attribute, if they were like override settings instead,
Or,
like just
it
in
could
terms
be
of
add
naming.
global attribute, add
Like add
property,
attribute says how it works. Like it doesn't say
What you're,
what you use it for.
yeah,
So if we want to remove
I like what you're saying, actually. Yeah.
the add attributes, it does make the program model look, kind of bifurcate, right? Because now you have your design time and your runtime way. It might make usability easier in some ways and more difficult, or not
What do you mean?
discoverable.
You already have a design time and runtime. Design time is I apply an attribute to a bunch of APIs. Runtime is I call these methods.
Well, no, I meant like if you can't use a design time attribute for whatever reason,
Yes.
you probably are familiar with the design time attribute because you couldn't use it. Can't use attributes, I guess. So
Why
instead
would
of
you be?
having,
If you couldn't use them, that doesn't mean that you are familiar. For example, I don't own the types,
sure,
so I didn't
okay,
apply the attributes. Therefore, I don't know anything about.
but
the
you
attributes.
probably, in general, the preferred model is to use attributes if you can. I mean, I think for a few different reasons. And by having the attributes there, and more or less the same program model to add them at runtime, I think it does prevent extra explosions of options, and things like the camel casing, make that a property on the actual options class would have to be like a base class of some option of some kind of converter, because we want to enable people to create their own snake casing or whatever.
No, this is just a global setting. You can then override it however you want using this other mechanism.
Oh, okay. So you're saying keep the add attribute? I thought maybe we were talking about removing that and just
No.
Okay.
He was talking about renaming it. But the name.
Yeah. Okay. So I
he
mean,
was saying to add extra
Well,
methods
there
for the
was
super
so
complex.
we explored for a moment, like if we remove this overload that doesn't take anything, and basically all global options are applied using regular strongly typed APIs.
I mean, I think
I
like
don't
so the question is like if you look at how people use attributes, right? I think the trend I've seen is like you saw this with math, for example. People don't like attributes, right? So people really like convention-based configuration. So I think a good chunk of people will try whatever it takes to avoid putting attributes on the actual types. They would just try to configure all the state that they can via this instance, and then just say, "This is how I want my shit to look like. This is the policy I want globally."
I'm fine with doing whatever we agree on, but if we wanted to do this, I'm tempted to say we have no attributes then, and we only have.
No, I think there's like different schools of thought, right? Some people say, for my wire format, I don't want global state. I want everything to be on the types because then I can reason about what's happening. I don't have to look at two things. The other people say, no, I want to minimize the lines of code that I write in my DTO, so I don't want any attributes there because they're ugly. I just want to have a configuration somewhere central that says, here's the policy that I want. Either I ignore read-only, I don't, I set them, I have camel case or whatever the thing is. And then all my shit just looks the same way. And I think, I honestly think they're just different ways of doing things. I think they're both fine. It just means that you may have customers who will never use attributes. That might just be.
Yeah. So, for example, I'm thinking about in
Follow.
Azure SDK, we would very strongly prefer not to have any attributes on the model types. And the reason is that the fact that these things are serialized, deserialized is just an implementation detail. When you look at the API, you call something like, do something, Azure do something, and then you get an object graph, and I would want the object graph to not have artifacts that are for internal implementation detail of us moving
So
this
let's
thing.
explore that just for a second. So what about the scenario that Steve brought up where you want to override a single property in your class?
Well,
This one here is snake case.
Yeah.
Like, how do we do that
So-
without the attribute?
So we talked about this,
Okay, I understand.
and I would prefer a model where there's a callback, and basically I get to do some transformations that I want. So by default, the serializer just use POC or some conventions. And maybe I change the setting that I want camel casing to be changed to this or something, using the options. And then for like very fine control, I would prefer to have a, callback. And I do whatever I want with the property. The property is called foo. I can now rename it to camel cased foo bar.
So I just want to poke at this a bit more. So like Emo, you said like, oh, like both models are good. People will use both models, but we're hearing from like ASP.NET and Azure that maybe the attribute model isn't for them. So I want to actually poke at what Steve said, which is like you'd be inclined to not have attributes
for
a
V1. Yeah,
exactly, for a V1. So do you feel it's like a showstopper not to have attributes if we go to the model that Azure would prefer?
Just to be completely, we also
Mm.
also need this kind of deserialization of immutable object graphs. Otherwise, we cannot use this feature. So,
Well, you can,
what?
you can use the serializer.
Sure, I guess we could use the serializer. And then when something comes back, we use the DOM, which is what we do today.
I'm poking at this specifically for like feature creep.
If we want to have an MVP and attributes aren't required, and we want a runtime mechanism for our core consumer, I think it might make sense to cut all attributes.
Wait, cutting all attributes?
Well, like I said, if this is an MVP and we're going to have a secondary way to do this through runtime, which the main consumer for V1 is going to use anyway.
Okay,
Well, it's not us; it's our customers.
so we are out of time. So like,
I think
let's.
people would be very confused. by that.
But I mean, like you're changing the settings already. I mean, for camel.
Right. So we change like what we do with today with JSON.NET is we change camel casing, and we change a couple of security settings to be basically secure enough for the web, and that's the extent to which we customize settings. And the rest is up to the user what they want. And they can both customize the global settings that we own and manage, and they can customize their own types. I think it's very confusing to like try to provide migration guidance to somebody and say, here's your class for JSON.NET. Here's your class for JSON.NET where you put the attributes somewhere else in the code.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm concerned about.
Okay.
I think like attributes and serialization are just so standard that I think not having them at all seems a bit over the top. But I mean, I would like to see what it would look like, because we also said earlier that even if you have attributes, do we want the programming model on the options class to mirror that, right? Because if we don't have them, we presumably have some other way of doing it, and it seems more natural in that case. So it would be interesting to just look at it and see like what that world would look like.
My personal preference would be attributes for the people who need them, like ASP.NET scenarios, and a programming model that doesn't ever say the word attribute for doing it programmatically, but I don't care enough to say that the second one has.
Right.
It just feels more natural to, if I'm trying to configure this at runtime, attributes don't matter. Attributes are just a way to get the runtime policy loaded. And I want to edit the policy, not that.
And internally, if you want to have a common implementation and you still use attributes, that's fine. But think about it the following way. I call add attribute, type, property, and then I pass ignore case. Why would I not just call a method ignore case type property name?
All right, we are out of time, unfortunately.
Right? It seems kind of weird that I have to new up an attribute so I can pass it here just to tell you that I want this property on this type to be ignored. Case.
So we're out of time. I mean, it's bifurcation of the program model.
Yeah, like as I said, like I mean, I would like to just see what it would look like. I mean, that would be to me the actual item to look into. All right, see you guys later.